In this week's Q&A video, we cover 3 interesting questions. The first one is from someone that's moved from Dubai to South Africa, and they want to know whether they should be buying or renting. Obviously, I love some buy and rent analysis. The second question is about someone that has received a bonus and they want to know where they should be investing it. And also they live abroad or they live outside South Africa. They're not tax resident in South Africa and they want to understand their options with their retirement annuity. Also someone asking about earning foreign currency and if they can be smart about their foreign currency. And actually there's a last note from a financial advisor that I would also like to address. Okay, perfect. So let's get started. First question is someone that's moved from Dubai to South Africa and he wants to know whether he should be buying or renting. If you want like a full analysis on buy or rent, I obviously have a video that covers that in detail. Of course, now the big question, you must be thinking this now, is but after the rental period, or if you rent a property for 10 years, you won't have anything to show for it. And if you buy a property, of course, after 10 years or 20 years, you're going to own something. We're assuming you would be investing that difference. Of course, if you're not like a hardcore stock market investor like I am, and you would just spend that, then of course you will be better off rather buying a property. But if you're rather renting and investing the difference compared to what you would have paid as a buyer, then you could potentially be better off, because that would mean, yes, you won't own the property after 20 years, but you would have a quite significant stock market or a stock portfolio after 20 years. So those are the 2 things that the one thing I would consider. And there are many other things to consider, because a property concentrates a lot of your net worth to one single asset, especially if this is like the first big thing that you're adding to your investment portfolio or to your net worth. And it's very dependent on the area that you're in. It's not like a global ETF that gives you exposure to multiple currencies and multiple countries and multiple industries. So the risk is quite concentrated by putting so much of your net worth into a property. But there is something else that is like super important to mention. This is so dependent on this is obviously country dependent, right? But also very dependent on the like your stage of life. Because if you are in a spot where you actually want a house close to a school, once you have kids like I do now, I start realizing these things, because you know, when we lived in London and Zurich, it was very easy to move around and just rent, because we knew that we weren't going to be in that place permanently. And we also started you start quite small with a small apartment, and then later you'll go bigger and bigger. The thing is, if you want to settle close to a school, close to your job, and also you want to perhaps buy something because you feel like you want to add a swimming pool or you want to add a braai or whatever, then at some point it could make sense for you to buy a property. So I'm just purely looking at this from like a numbers point of view. Personally, I still rent, even though we could buy a property, yes. I still prefer to rent, but it might change in the future, and I'll definitely make a video about that. And that's just when we know like where we're going to stay permanently, and also where our son goes to school, or perhaps our future kids, our property buy versus rent decision might change. Okay, so that's first question done. Next question is in Dubai. She says that she received a bonus and she wanted to put it away for the future, so she invested in a retirement annuity, and she's still contributing to that every month. And she's now more financially literate, and she would actually rather prefer to use her TFSA and also put that into ETFs rather. And then she asks about what are her options. She's currently working abroad, so she's not a tax resident in South Africa, but she intends to retire in South Africa, so that could potentially have an impact. So this is her info. What I would say to this is, the first thing, if you're a retirement annuity, the big advantage of a retirement annuity is that it has a tax advantage for you. If you're a taxpayer in South Africa, then you can deduct some of your retirement or all of your retirement contributions up to a certain limit, 27.5% of your salary, or up to 350,000 a year. You can deduct that. But since she's not a tax resident, then I am like not seeing that tax advantage, to be honest. So I would, question whether this is a good investment vehicle to use. The next point is that if you are outside South Africa, you can definitely, South Africans can also do this, but it's possible for you to open an international brokerage account, which means you earn your money offshore, you keep it offshore, and you invest it offshore. So that actually helps in a way that you don't have to convert it to something to rand and then to invest in rand. And that is, even though you can invest in international ETFs in rand terms, this just allows you to kind of hold your money outside South Africa and build your portfolio outside while you are outside South Africa. The retirement annuity options would be, you could obviously, there are a few things that you could consider. You could consider, just stopping your contributions there and rather making that somewhere else. That's the first thing. The second thing is also, a lot of expats actually don't realize this, but if you've been a non-tax resident in South Africa for longer than 3 years, for 3 years minimum, then you're actually able to extract or withdraw your retirement annuity. Of course, that could have tax implications for you, so definitely look into the tax implications first, because up to a certain amount, it's like a marginal increase in terms of how much it is taxed at. But that could also give you a way to perhaps, if you want to, move it into a different investment. But I would definitely encourage you to first consider the trade-off in terms of the tax payable versus what else you could or would like to do with that money in the RA. Okay, so I think that I don't obviously, without knowing all of the background info, I don't want to be too specific, or I want to rather give you some things to think about and then have you research that further and think about what you think is best for your scenario. Okay, so then the next question says, I am a South African earning US dollars, which is sent to my South African bank account monthly, which of course converted to ZAR. And I've been searching for a way to keep some of it in US dollar, because currently I am investing in an S&P 500 ETF within my tax-free savings account. However, this is only after my salary has been converted to ZAR. Do you have any suggestion on what else I could do to keep my salary in US dollars before it converted to ZAR? So the thing is, if you want to be paid into a US dollar account, you would need a US dollar bank account, of course. And in order to open bank accounts offshore, it's actually quite complex, and it would still obviously mean that you're taxed on that money. Depending on how big your income and how big your business is, you could, there's also a consideration, you could consider registering a business offshore. So actually operating from an offshore business, but that usually comes with a little bit of complexity and extra admin, because it's not always very easy or straightforward to open a business offshore as if you're not a resident in that country. There might be some extra admin, but at a certain size of business or income, it could start making sense. So that's something to consider. And this obviously would mean that you would then perhaps pay yourself a salary or you could also pay yourself dividends if you're an owner of the business. There are a few ways, that you could structure the business. But one thing I would say is that if you are able to open an account that allows you to receive money in dollars, then you would still be taxed on the full amount in South Africa, because you are taxed, if you're a South African tax resident, you're taxed on global income. And I'm assuming that you are based in South Africa all the time, or a majority of your time. But then the last thing is that, whether you are converting your money to rand and then investing in a US dollar investment, like an S&P 500 investment, for example, or whether you're doing that offshore and keeping your money in US dollars, you are still getting access to the same underlying investments, because the index that you're tracking is the S&P 500 index. So you're actually holding the same, in essence, the investment is the same, except for, of course, you're holding it in rand terms, which means there's an extra currency conversion cost, which I assume you're very much aware of, the fact that you're converting dollar to ZAR directly in your bank account, or your bank does that probably at not a very favorable exchange rate. So I would actually look into what that exchange is costing you, and just for that reason, consider whether a US dollar bank account could make sense. Also, if you hold US dollar investments, typically USD ETFs actually have less, or not USD, because that could potentially attract higher tax for you. But usually we look at potentially investing in UCITS ETFs, which are offshore ETFs, but they are domiciled in Ireland so that they don't attract the US CITES tax. Those ETFs are actually larger. So because of the bigger volume, they're run by Vanguard or iShares, for example, much, much larger ETFs compared to the local ones. They can have much lower fees, because it is a little bit of a volume game. And their fees are lower there compared to South African ETFs. So there is actually a little bit of an advantage on the fees. And the last thing is that there could be an advantage on the capital gains tax, because capital gains tax in South Africa on your ETF in South Africa would be payable on your ZAR gains, where if we're assuming that the rand in the long term would continue to depreciate against the dollar, then your gains would only be in US US dollar, if you hold US dollar denominated ETFs, then that could attract a lower capital gains tax for you if you eventually sell those ETFs in future when you want to, for example, retire and use the money. So yeah, there are a few things to consider. Of course, also having your portfolio offshore does attract some additional admin because this won't directly, feed into your tax returns or your annual filings. That would mean you will have to extract the information from your brokerage platform and make sure that you have the right information to submit. Okay, so last thing here to mention is that we have an advisor that wanted me to anonymously say something. And he said that, "Hey Carla, I wanted to say I really enjoy your content. I do find it quite valuable. That said, I do think it's important to guide people towards asking the right questions when working with advisors rather than swaying them away from us altogether. There are definitely advisors who overcharge, but not all of us operate like that. A good advisor helps clients make the right financial decisions through life, especially during tough emotional periods where people tend to make poor calls on their own. Also, the ongoing service fee exists for a reason." So he basically tries to explain, why the fees exist, and that paying a 2% total fee on a well-managed fund that returns 14% is way better than paying 0.8% fees just to get a 8% return, for example. Okay, so he basically makes the argument or tries to explain that not all advisors are bad, and I shouldn't, make blanket statements to discourage people from using advisors, and that also if you, after paying fees, are net off better, then you're actually in a better position. I want to address something like that because obviously my channel is to encourage people to take control of their finances, and I want you to realize that it's possible, that it's not that complex, and that you can be a DIY investor. That being said, there are some people that are afraid of technology or are, let's say professional sportsmen, for example, that don't want to touch their finances or be involved with this at all. Although I would still encourage you to have a very good understanding of how index funds work and how your fees are structured in your portfolio. Because the more you know, the better decisions you can make, the better questions you can ask, and to be able to have discussions, even if you're deciding to use an advisor. So my husband actually worked as a private banker for high net worth individuals in Switzerland. And after that for a family office. Once clients reach a certain net worth or a certain level of complexity in their affairs. So they have a trust, they've got many different properties, they've got companies, they've got offshore and local investments. And they obviously work very, very hard because some of these high net worth individuals have their own companies, or it could be someone that inherited a lot of money. But in some cases, like this case, I would understand why someone would choose to use an advisor. Although when your assets become at a significant level like that, then your fees drop significantly as well, because obviously fees on big portfolios, they would charge less fees if you bring a big portfolio for them to manage. But this is obviously done at a very sophisticated level. So just assuming that an advisor is going to put you in a better position because you're paying a 2% fee, for example, I would not at all want to put that assumption out there, because if you know how to invest in index funds and you understand that it's so hard to beat the index performance over the long term, I've got a lot of videos that explains that, and also you can go and watch Ben Felix's videos on YouTube. Is really amazing. But it's so hard. So if you know that, buying an index fund puts you already in a very good position, the chances of you going with someone that advises you to go into a different fund and actually outperforming that index net off fees after you've taken fees off, it's very, very slim. And you can also go do some research on SPIVA scorecards, because this is a way for you to track performance of active funds versus passive funds and how few of them actually outperform passive funds. My message is not to say don't talk to them. No, I think definitely people sometimes need financial planning assistance, for sure. How much you put away, how much you need to retire, how to plan for certain goals, or even how to do it in a tax smart way. And I would, still encourage you to look for an hourly based fee though, because over the long term, a 20% fee, that depends on the returns of the portfolio, but a 2%, not a 20% fee, a 2% fee over 40 years could literally cost you more than 20 or 30% in value in your portfolio. And this is because you're missing out on a lot of compounding potential. And if you're paying consistently you don't even realize that you're paying these fees, right? Because they're being deducted from your investments on an annual or quarterly basis. If you're consistently giving away 2% of your returns, that significantly hinders the compounding that can happen in your portfolio. So my first port of call is you can be a DIY investor. It's not that complex. Educate yourself, learn how to do it, buy long-term ETF investments. And then if you need to meet with someone because you're scared you're going to make a poor decision or you're not sure how much, try to find an advisor that's going to charge you on an hourly basis. But I mean, I completely understand actually that these, the numbers on these business models are really hard for them also to make it work. So they also need to make a living, that's for sure. They need to charge proper fees for them to also make a living. But I would say that you don't have to pay those fees if you can do it yourself. And yeah, I guess that's like my main message around this. But happy to have further questions on that or further comments. Okay, those are all the questions for this week. Submit your questions in the caption of the video or of the podcast, and happy to answer more of your questions in the next session. See you next time.